Dear children, today we'll discuss gamete transfer in angiosperm. So before that, let me have a very quick recapitulation of the previous presentation. So in the previous presentation, I explained you the gamete transfer in different organisms, right? And gamete transfer is a event in the pre-fertilization, that means before fertilization the gamete transfer takes place, right? Here we will discuss the gamete transfer in angiosperm, that means gamete transfer in angiosperm, that means flowering plant. How in case of flowering plant the gamete transfer takes place, will give emphasis to this one, right? So let me show you one picture that already I have discussed with you. So here you see, this is the sweet potato flower, and already I have mentioned this is a bisexual flower. It is having stamen and it is having stigma. So in case of flowering plant, where the male gamete are produced, the male gamete are present inside the pollen grain. Remember, male gametes in case of angiosperm are present inside the pollen grain, and pollen grains are present inside the anther. So when the anthers gets matured, it bursts and releases the pollen grain, and the pollen grain now comes to the air. Or if it is in aquatic medium, if any flowering plant is in aquatic medium, the pollen grain will release into the water. So pollen grain is released to the surrounding. Now the pollen grain is transferred to the egg, and where the egg is present in flowering plant, remember, egg is present inside the ovule. And where the ovule present? Ovule is present inside the ovary. And where is ovary? Ovary is a part of pistil. Ovary is the basal swollen part of pistil. So this is a pistil, you see. This is a pistil, right? And pistil has three parts. The anterior part, anterior flat portion is known as stigma. Then there is a slender stalk which connects the stigma to the basal swollen portion, that is the ovary. So this is stigma, this is style, the slender portion, stalk portion, and this is the ovary. So ovule is present inside the ovary, and inside the ovule egg is present. So that means the male gametes present inside the pollen grain released from anther needs to reach to this egg. So how this transfer takes place, that we will discuss here. So let me explain you first how the pollen grain is released to the pistil. Then we will discuss how the male gamete reaches to the female gamete or the egg, right? So here you see, there is no complex mechanism. There is no need of any complex mechanism for the transfer of pollen grain. Why? Because the both stigma and anther are present very close to each other. So whenever anther gets matured and bursted, the pollen grains fall on the stigma, right? So this is a very easy and simple process. There may not be any agent required for the transfer, right? Then come to the next type of cases. Here, this plant also I have already shown you. This is a cucurbit plant where two different types of flowers are present in the single plant. That means the plant is bisexual, but the flowers are unisexual, right? So here the anther is present inside this flower. This is the male flower. Anther is present inside it. This is the female flower. This is the ovary, I have already explained you. And the stigma is present inside this petal. The stigma present inner to this petal. Right? So that means for the process of gamete transfer, pollen grain needs to released from this flower and transferred to this flower and land on the stigma. So for that they need some external agent. That may be air, that may be insect, that may be any other mode. Right? So here the pollen grains are released from the anther of the male flower and reaches to the stigma of the female flower. Clear? Then third case, this flower also already, this plant also I have already shown you. This is a male papaya plant. This is a female papaya plant. So here the pollen grain released from the anther of male flower needs to transfer to the female flower present in a different or present in another plant, present maybe in the surrounding or maybe any other place. That means here it needs to transfer through the air or any other agent for a relatively long distance. Right? So these are the cases of gamete transfer. So here you see the pollen grains are transferred to what? Transferred to the stigma of female flower. So this process of transfer of pollen grain from anther of a flower to the stigma of the flower, stigma of the same or another flower, is known as pollination. And if we talk about the first case of bisexual flower, then you see the pollination takes place in the same flower, that is known as self-pollination. Remember, note down, the pollination takes place in a bisexual flower is known as self-pollination because in the same flower it takes place. Pollination in case of papaya plant, that means here the pollination takes place between two plants. So this is known as cross pollination. Right? But this case is the gamete is the pollen grain is transferred from one flower to another flower. So that means cross pollination. But it takes place in the same plant. So we can describe it as the pollination is morphologically cross-pollination, because morphologically if we analyze, if we study, the pollination takes place from one flower, pollination takes place in which pollen grain is transferred from one flower to another flower. That is the definition of cross-pollination. So morphologically it is cross-pollination. But if we see the genetics of anther, pollen grain is similar to the genetics of the female gamete. So that means genetically that takes place in the same. So this is genetically self-pollination. Right? So this is the process of transfer of pollen grain. Then the question is how the male gamete is transferred to the female gamete, because till now pollen grain has been transferred to the stigma of the female flower. Right? So let me explain how the gamete is transferred. So here you see. This is the structure of a pollen grain. Right? So what happens? Pollen grain is released and fall on the stigma. So remember, stigma consists of some nutritive solution. Therefore, stigma is sticky in nature. So when the pollen grain is released and fall on the stigma, it absorbs the nutrition and germinates. So when you see, when the pollen grain germinates, that forms a pollen tube like this. Right? And what happens? Pollen grain inside it contains male gamete. So when the pollen grain germinates to form pollen tube, the male gamete present inside it is migrate or shifted to the tip of the pollen tube. That means now the male gametes are present in the tip of the tube like this. So now when the pollen grain is fall on the stigma, it germinates, produces the pollen tube, and the pollen tube gradually moves downward to the ovule. So when the pollen tube extends downward, the male gametes present at the tip also moves downward. And when the pollen tube reaches at the ovule, that releases the male gamete. Here it discharges the male gamete. And inside this ovule, here egg is present. So when the pollen tube, tip of the pollen tube break, it releases the male gamete, so that male gamete can come closer to the female gamete, and that leads to fertilization process. Clear? So this way pollination takes place, followed by the transfer of male gamete to the egg in case of angiosperm. So now I think you all are very much clear about this process. So here you see just a quick revision. Pollen grains are produced in the anther, already I have told you, by the process of meiotic division, and they carry male gametes. Pollen grains carry male gametes. Ovule present inside ovary contain the egg. Pollen grain is transferred to the stigma to reach to the egg present in ovary for fertilization, and this is known as pollination. In case of bisexual flower, pollen grains soon after release come in contact with stigma of the same flower, and the process is known as self-pollination. Already I have told you. And in case of unisexual flower like papaya, pollen grains after release transferred to the stigma of the female flower by the help of agent, and the process is known as cross-pollination. Already I have explained to you. So then pollen grains after landing on stigma germinates to produce pollen tube. The pollen tube carries the male gamete at its tip and move towards ovule and discharge the male gamete near the egg for the process of fertilization. So that's all about gamete transfer in angiosperm. Thank you.